Hello and welcome back. And that is right, today we want to return to the subject of this. This is the Jonsbo N5, arguably, I would say, one of the best NAS cases I've ever seen. It supports ITX, ATX, all of the different kinds of motherboards you can think of. It's ridiculously high, it's ridiculously deep, it supports a huge amount of storage. This system is a beast. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to build it. But I'm going to say straight away, Jonsbo's come a long way with their cases. Ever since we talked about the N1, 2, N3, N4, etc., this has been, by and large, the most straightforward case I've ever built from them. And unlike a lot of my other build videos, probably the timeline below is going to be a lot shorter. And a big part of that is we've simply got more space to play with now than we've had in previous generations. Now, the order with which you put the components inside is still going to be very paramount, and definitely routing of those cables more so than anything. But I will say that certain architectural changes in this case over other Jonsbos, if you have built other Jonsbo cases before, will certainly appeal to you. Number one, the fact that the spay cage here on the front, and you'll see it later in the video, can actually be removed out. It's held in place with a screw at the bottom, and then from there you can access a lot of the cabling and routing of those cables for the back through the front of the case, something that previous generation Jonsbos you couldn't do. You had to be heavily reliant on the removal the rear panel inside. Another thing I'll highlight when it comes to the removal of the top of the case, held in place with 6 screws, 3 on each side, is that the internal casing is a great deal easier to access, and therefore when it comes to when you've laid out the cables, you've actually got a lot more room to play with. So again, if you've watched my other videos on building previous generation Jonsbo cases, just keep in mind that although this is not the easiest case to build up from, it is significantly easier than other Jonsbo cases. The last thing I want to touch on is the idea about your motherboard and your CPU. Now, it's worth keeping in mind this video is more about the building of the NAS after you've set your CPU fan, your CPU cooler, call it what you like. And ultimately, it's going to be very hard to cover that in this video. I've already covered it in other videos, and there are other dedicated videos about the setting of a CPU cooler. But just keep that the height on this is 106 millimeters there. So you can't exceed that number, but it's still a huge amount of space to play with there when it comes to your CPU cooler. Personally, I go for tower coolers, so less so like this one. This is quite a deep cooler. I quite like static coolers like this one, which give you the option down the road of adding a fan there to be based on board, but then you're kind of dependent on the CPU fan and the ports on your motherboard of choice being available to add more fans. Keep in mind, this system already has multiple fan outlets and fan upgrade outlets on it. But compared with desktop grade CPUs like this one, there's actually a lot of interesting mobile and NAS focused and service focused CPUs out there that arrive pre-soldered to motherboards. You can keep it small with something like that. That's an N305 i8 processor there on board. This is a 200 to 220 quid Mobo. This arrives with that 8-core i3 CPU on board. It even has 10 GBE on the rear there, but it's ITX, which is kind of a waste of time for something like this. You can, of course, go for more aggressive processors. You can get 12th, 13th, and I'm sure even 14th generation mobile version or SoC CPUs for motherboards pre-attached from, third-party companies like CWWK and Topton, or you can go for more localized companies as well. Again, there's some good mobos that you can get without CPUs bundled inside. The point I'm making is if you want to go for a mobile CPU, because it's a lot more efficient when it comes to long-term power utilization, then in that case, most mobile CPUs are very hard to buy off the shelf. A lot of the time, the best of those CPUs, particularly the more modern ones, are only available to buy directly attached to motherboards. That's the other reason why I'm not including the CPU setting in this video, because chances are, if you're going for a mobile CPU in this and you're prioritizing a huge amount of storage with an efficient CPU mobile combo, chances are you're going to have to go for a bundle where the CPU cooler setting is going to be already done for you. Next up, when it comes to the PSU, you're going to have to go for an 80X PSU there. You can't exceed 170mm, but that's still a decent amount of space to play with. Also, keep in mind that this is a 12-bay SATA storage system with slots for additional 2.5 SATA, so you're going to need SATA cables there. Each of the individual bays at the front runs into a PCB internally that has its own dedicated SATA output there. So you're going to need those cables. I would recommend going for fan-out cables. So for as little as $5 or $10, you can get hold of fan-out cables where all of the adapters are at either end. And you can get them at 30, 50, 60, sometimes a meter long. You'll need to go for at least 50 to 60 centimeters to cover the distance between the internal motherboard and all the way round to the corner SATA port there internally. Alternatively, some motherboards, like some of the ones I've shown you earlier on, are taking advantage of SFF connectors there, which feed out into multiple SATA connectors. So you can use a cable like this, where one end goes into the motherboard with a single connector, fanning out into multiple individual SATAs there. So double check if your motherboard has that on board, rather than getting numerous SATA cables where it turns out you could have got away with a 1 to 4 or 1 to 6 fan out. Keep in mind, this case also utilizes separate SATA and Molex power inputs there on rear. You've got two Molex adapters here on the left, and you've got further SATA/Molex on the other. Later on in the video, when we do our connections of those cables, you'll see what I mean. But chances are your PSU that you get for this case, it might not have enough Molex and SATA. So don't be afraid to look out in advance for $1 to $2 SATA to Molex adapters, where you can split one individual SATA output coming off this board into two Molex. Don't worry about not having enough SATA, because the SATA power coming off of this, you're not going to be feeding it directly into these drives. All 8 of these drives, all 8 on one side and 4 on the other side, are fed into those PCBs, which are then being power delivered via Molexes into them. You won't need to use the individual SATA coming off this PSU on each of those drives. And finally, we've got to talk about this as such a large case, but the chances of you having a motherboard that has got 12 SATA connectors on it is pretty darn slim, even more so when you're looking at more modest mobos, be it M80X or MITX. So one of the best ways to get around that, although it will cost you one of your M.2 slots, is an M.2 adapter like this one here. It utilizes one M.2 slot on your host machine, but you can connect 6 SATA connectors into that. Keep in mind, if you are using SATA SSDs and that M.2 is restricted at times 1 speed at Gen 3 or even Gen 2, you're going to be seeing a drop in performance. So keep in mind, this is a great solution for hard drives, but when it comes to SATA SSDs, make sure you've got enough lane distribution there for this little board and the controller on board to not end up bottlenecking you. We've got to talk about those PCIe slots on here. Now, one of the main attractive points about this case, aside from its huge amount of storage, is if you do use full ATX motherboards or even E-ATX motherboards, you're going to have a lot of PCIe slots to play with and plenty of outputs there. However, again, trying to find a motherboard that's going to give you the ability to populate all 8 of these slots is probably not hugely likely, and years down the road you might want to do something about that to include extra cards, but your motherboard doesn't really have the facility for that. And in that scenario, there are loads of M.2 to PCIe adapters open to you. Now, some of them, like this one, will allow you to add an M.2, this is a Gen 4x4 M.2, into a full physical 16 speed slot here. Obviously, it will be restricted to 4, but you could utilize this inside to use an M.2 slot and add another PCIe card there. Some of them are a little bit more engineered. So for some of them, you've got one like this that allows you to supply an external PCIe if you don't have a physical slot there inside, but you just need the board to sit inside the case. Nevertheless, and you're using perhaps a smaller motherboard but want to use the afforded space there to balance and place a card on a PCB. Alternatively, we've got other options that supply power from the PSU via a SATA input that feeds directly into the PCB. Alternatively, you can use something like this that allows you via an M.2 4x4 slot there to add OCuLink. This is a very small port here, but this wouldn't even use one of those PCIe slots. You could use an M.2, and this would allow you to use 64 gigabit transfers externally to add something like an external GPU with relative ease. Finally, if you're only looking at network performance, you can go for something very straightforward like this from IOCrest. This retails for about 60 to 80 nika, depending where you are, and it utilizes an M.2 and goes straight out into a 10 gigabit Ethernet port. The point I'm making is, don't feel you've got to go for a giant motherboard in this with loads of PCIe slots down the road to occupy this, because there are ways and means to add more PCIe slots to your system, or at least the capability of PCIe, very easily. But I think I've used enough of your time on the old yabba yabba. Let's grab our screwdriver and get to work. So before we go any further, what we need to immediately do is make sure we've got all of the accessories for our build. Now, inside the kit should be the unit itself. There should also be screws for the 2.5-inch media and for mounting the motherboard internally. There should be a separate bag that contains the rubber screws and the rubber handles for your hard drive installation. There should also be cable ties. And finally, there should be 3 mesh panels that are designed to be fitted inside the case around some of the ventilation points. Once you've assured that you've got all of those parts, the final thing you need to find in that kit is a small white-handled screwdriver with a hexagonal tip. Once you've unpacked the Jonsbo N5 case, take the white-tipped hexagonal screw included with the accessories and remove all 6 screws, 3 aside, that keep the top panel of the N5 case in place, and then put those screws safely to one side and remove the top panel. Next, get yourself a crosshead screwdriver and remove the 4 screws in all 4 corners of the rear dual fan plate on the rear of the casing there. It should come off easily, but keep in mind that it may well still be attached via the fan power cable to the rear of the casing. Once you've done that, remove the plate where the PSU of your installation is going to take place. It's 4 screws in either corner of the PSU plate, and you're going to need that later on to attach it to your ATX PSU. Finally, with the same screwdriver, head to the front of the system, remove the front panel via the little pull handle, and then on the left-hand side, remove the cage that has the 4 individual SATA storage bays. It's held in place with screws here, and it can be removed very easily. The reason we're doing this is in a moment we're going to be funneling the cables from the PSU, and it makes it a great deal easier to funnel the cables appropriately. Next up, we want to funnel the SATA cables that we're going to be utilizing in the storage area. It's easier to do it now before we install the PSU. Now, there's a small cavity on the right-hand side, hexagonal, above the 4-bay cage. Slot your SATA cables through that cavity, as this is where they're going to need to funnel onto the motherboard later. Now, you need to connect all 12 bays appropriately. Bays 1 to 4 are located on the removable 4-bay cage from earlier. Then attach bays 5 through 12 into the 8-bay cage area. Now, once you've attached these, make sure you've kept note of which SATA cables are in which SATA interfaces there, as later on when you connect them to the motherboard, you're going to need to make sure that, for example, bay 1 on the motherboard is appropriate to bay 1 on the case. It's not life or death, but it will make troubleshooting down the line easier. If possible, use one of the cable ties temporarily or permanently to attach all of the 12 SATA cables to the outside of the case framework there. Again, this isn't essential, but it will ensure that when you are putting in the PSU later, that you don't lose a cable accidentally. Take the 3 vent panels included with the accessory kit and attach the smaller of the 3 on the inside of where the 4-bay SATA cage is there, where your PSU is about to go. Then take the 2 larger panels and attach them on the inside of the top removable panel on the left and right hand side. They should have adhesive on the inside, although I have heard that some of these fans are magnetic. Next up is one of the more complicated parts. This is where we have to funnel the cabling from the PSU around the casing. Take your time with this step, as if this goes wrong, you'll have to redo a lot of the work. Take the rear plate that you removed from the case earlier and attach it to the rear of the PSU, ensuring that the fan from the PSU is on the right-hand side, and therefore it's going to be in alignment with the small panel that you attached the mesh onto earlier on. Next, you need to identify the power connectors that are going to be utilized on the motherboard. These can be a 20-pin connector and some 4 and 6-pin bulk connectors there. These are important and need to be established first. Once you've identified these cables, you need to run these in the cavity above the 8 individual hard drives. There is a long, thin, rectangular cavity that you need to slide those cables into so they can poke out where the motherboard is going to be. Next, you're going to have to supply power to the individual storage bays. The rear of both the back panels of the 4 and the 8 bay areas utilize a combination of SATA and Molex connectors. As mentioned in the introduction, if you don't have enough Molex outputs on your PSU, you can buy SATA to Molex splitter cables that allow you to cover the difference. There are 3 individual Molex power connectors and 2 individual SATA power connectors. Finally, if you've got any fans in your system that aren't connected, or you've added additional fans that you've added to your case build, now is the time to attach them back onto the PCBs on each of the drive bays, as they will become increasingly difficult to do so. Again, pay special attention to the fan connectors on that 2-bay fan cage you removed at the start to access this whole area. At this point, you should have all of your SATA connectors attached, all of your PCB drive power connectors attached, and your fan connectors attached. You can slide in the PSU now. From this point, if you haven't already done so, you can slide back in the 4-bay SATA cage, and you can now reattach the rear 2-bay fan assembly and attach the PSU with all 4 of its screws into the back of the case. Now, from this point, you're going to need to move all of the cables from the PSU towards the front of the chassis. The same goes for the cables that are coming off of the front panel. Make sure all of these cables are as close to the front and leaning over the top of the front of the chassis as possible. And make sure that all of your SATA cables that you've ran through the small cavity on the right-hand side are also completely out of the way. Next, get ready to place your motherboard. Attach all of the individual riser screws in the appropriate areas of the internal cavity. You'll be able to see above certain screws the letters ATX, MATX, ITX. These all indicate where you need to put those handle risers for your motherboard appropriate to your own motherboard of choice. Now you've placed the risers in their appropriate positions for your motherboard, you can place the motherboard in the area. Now keep in mind the ports have to be rear facing. There's a small cavity for the back plane where you can place your motherboard in the correct location there. You'll know that it's all in the right place as the screw holes on the motherboard will match those of the risers that you've placed earlier. Now, the next part is going to differ depending on your own setup and your own motherboard. The cables that need to be attached will be as follows. You'll need to attach the individual SATA connectors to each of the individual SATA outputs on the motherboard, and that if you are utilizing an M.2 or you're utilizing SFF fanouts for the SATA connectors, you're going to need to connect them as appropriate to your own setup there. Next, any additional fans that you've attached to this casing or fans that are yet to be connected that need to be connected directly to the motherboard can all be done now. Finally, power for the motherboard. You're going to need to attach the larger 20-pin PSU cable. Again, this is going to differ depending on your motherboard of choice as appropriate. The same goes for any 4, 6 or 8-pin power connectors. Again, it will differ depending on your motherboard, but at the very least there will be at least 2 PSU connectors. Likely there'll be 3 depending on the size of your motherboard. If you have any PCIe cards you intend to attach to your build, now's a great time to include them in the installation here. The same goes for any OS SSDs that are going to go in the M.2 slots or anything like that. Finally, you can also attach your memory right now, and hopefully you've already attached your PSU cooler to the motherboard as mentioned in the introduction. Next up, we need to do the storage media. Whether you're fully populating it or not, the process for each individual hard drive will be the same. For each drive, you're going to need one rubber handle with two of the black screws and attaching the handle to the drive at the non-SATA interface end. You also need to make sure that when you slide the drive into the system, that the SATA port is at the lower point of the drive. Each of the SATA connections will be at the bottom of the drive you're sliding in. Additionally, each drive needs to have 4 additional rubber grommets attached at the rear and the middle on either side of the drive. I still wish Jonsbo did traditional trays, but for now, this is what you've got. So each drive should have 4 rubber attachment grommets and the rubber handle. You can then slide on the individual sliding rails all 6 of the protruding grommets into the drive bay and then attach the drive to the rear SATA connector. Finally, you're going to need to attach the power and reset and LEDs from the case into your motherboard. Again, the placement of the F panel and the placement of those pins will differ ever so slightly depending on your motherboard, but make sure you've got these attached. Otherwise, not only will you not be able to monitor your system long term, you may not even be able to power the device on if you don't get the power on, off and reset correctly attached. Now you simply need to replace the top panel via the 6 screws you removed earlier, and you can get ready to start using your NAS. Make sure everything's connected appropriately, and from this point, any problems you encounter will almost certainly be those pertaining to the motherboard, perhaps the BIOS, those front panel pins, and other factors that are just too various to cover in a video like this. But the hard work is done, and you've now built your Jonsbo N5 case. Well done. And there you go. That is how to build your Jonsbo N5 NAS. I know this video isn't going to cover everyone, depending on your drive placement, your motherboard size, your PSU placement, your SATA cabling. It's going to be different for everyone, and I hope something in this video has helped you along the way. If you've got further questions on building your own Jonsbo N5, go to the comments below and ask me your questions. There's also a written breakdown of this alongside the N5 review that I do keep an eye on. So if you do have questions about your build, you can either use the comments, use that article, or just email me directly at robbie@nascompares, and I'll help you out as best I can. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you next time.